Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our Curious Amalgam. I'm Sergei Zaslavsky, and the title of today's episode is You're Charging Me How Much? A discussion on personalized and surveillance pricing. Some call it personalized pricing, some call it surveillance pricing. Whatever you call it, it's a practice that has increasingly been in the news recently. It refers to companies charging a price that is based on a customer's individual characteristics or circumstances. And while the practice is not new, as the availability of data in consumers and algorithms to process that data has grown, so has the potential impact of personalized pricing. How does this practice impact consumers, and how should policymakers and enforcers respond? We will discuss one expert's perspective on today's show. Let me introduce my co-host, Rubin Waranch. Hi, Rubin.
Thank you, Sergei. We're joined by Professor Sanjog Misra, the Charles H. Kelstadt Distinguished Service Professor of Marketing and Applied AI at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. Professor Misra is a recognized thought leader on consumer welfare implications of personalized pricing, among other focus areas. His work has been published in Econometrica, the Journal of Market Research, the Journal of Law and Economics, among others. Of particular note, Professor Misra published a working paper in 2021 titled Personalized Pricing and Consumer Welfare, right on point for today's discussion. Welcome to the podcast, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start by laying some groundwork. What is personalized pricing, or surveillance pricing, as some call it?
Okay, so let's back up a little bit. So the idea behind personalized pricing stems from what economists or academics would call third-degree price discrimination, which is this idea of tailoring prices as a function of individual characteristics. So we've seen this, for a while now. So if you've, a senior citizen discount or a student discount or ladies' night, these are all conditioning on certain characteristics of individuals and personalizing the prices based on those characteristics. And that's what we call personalized pricing. In the introduction, Sergei pointed out that there's a lot more data today. So the characteristics we use, that set has grown quite rich in recent years. And we do have algorithms now that can do this at scale. So the field of personalized pricing now is the use of algorithms and data to tailor prices to individuals, but rather not exactly individuals, but micro segments of individuals. I'll contrast that with the idea of surveillance pricing. This term is relatively recent, and I think the main difference between personalized pricing and surveillance pricing is one of intent. As the term surveillance kind of suggests, it's about kind of surveilling you, collecting your data with or without your permission and using that for pricing. So there's a little bit of a negative connotation for that to that. But the basic idea remains the same, which is to take data that is informative about your preferences, of your behaviors, and use that to set prices.
That context is super helpful. Just one follow-up. How should we think about price? Is it just the sticker price for the product or service charged to consumers?
No. So I think the way to think of personalized pricing is the effective price that each consumer ends up paying. So you could implement personalized pricing by changing the sticker price. So for example, you might see a different price in your email, or it might be implemented via a couponing mechanism. So you might offer a digital coupon or a physical coupon that's been tailored to your personal characteristics, or to your history, or to your demographics, if you will. So there's various mechanisms of personalization that can then interact with the pricing mechanism.
And what are the effects of personalized pricing on consumers? Is it good, or is it bad, or is it the lawyer's favorite answer? It depends.
Yeah, it's the lawyer's favorite answer. I'm glad you put it that way. I think it does depend on a number of things. And I think it's important to think about like what it's being conditioned on as well. So I think if you talk to people who think of this as surveillance pricing, let's get that piece out of the way. If the prices are using data that were collected illegally or data that the consumer does not wish to share with the firm, then obviously that's a bad thing. There's privacy violations. And that might, that's almost surely against the law. Now, if on the other hand, we're talking about personalization based on data that the consumer has willingly shared, even then, we're not entirely sure how it affects the broad swath of consumers. So it could be that it's good in the sense that a large number of individuals get discounts there compared to what they would have paid under a uniform price. But there are probably going to be some segments of consumers that pay higher prices, right? So what it boils down to answer your question, what it would boil down to is how do we evaluate different sets of consumers? How many benefit and how many lose out? And how do we aggregate those welfare measures? That's going to give you your answer. So it does depend on how we think of how we add things up, essentially.
And are there particular types of consumers that are usually made better off and other types of consumers that are usually made worse off?
Yeah, so if you think about it, like who do we think are the people who avail of rebates and discounts and look for better deals? Typically, those are the less affluent, the poor. So whenever there's personalization, you're going to have this mechanism by which poorer consumers or less affluent consumers are more often than not going to get better deals. And so it's going to benefit them, which means that, on the flip side, people who are more affluent, the rich, are probably not going to get kind of the implicit discount they would have gotten had prices been uniform. Now, I'll be the first to kind of acknowledge that this is not a general statement. We can always construct examples where this is not true, but invariably we think of lower prices being targeted towards the poor and higher prices being targeted towards the rich.
So the lens at which we look at effects matters in this discussion, and different contingents of our society may have different views, which is one of the reasons I find this such an interesting topic. Some people find the idea of personalized pricing off-putting insofar as they may feel manipulated by their own data and having no other choice in today's digital age as they give away their data in exchange for an app, for example. What's your take, not just as an economist, but as a smart person who's been thinking about this issue deeply for many years?
Yeah, so let's be clear about one thing, right? People are not complaining about personalization, not generally. What I mean by that is if you happen to get a good deal, a lower price, you're not going to be complaining about that. Invariably, the complaints will come if you feel you've paid too much for something or you've been asked to pay too much for something, right? And then it becomes an issue of like perceived fairness. You're both flying from New York to LA, pretty much the same seat in the same class, and there's a $200 difference in the fares. Whoever paid the higher price is going to feel like that was an unfair price. And then the question becomes, well, why did I have to pay that extra $200? And what was it about my data that tailored that price to me, if it was tailored? I'm not saying airlines do it exactly the same way, or let's say I got a coupon or I got a discount. Why did I get one and why did you not get one? It's always going to be a relative metric. And this idea of kind of fairness is kind of the key source of any discontent that consumers might have. And that's pretty much it, right? Like I said, like if you're getting a better deal, you're not complaining. If you're getting a worse deal, you are. I'll add a little bit, to that in the sense that personalization is not new. It's not something that just showed up with technology and kind of data and all these algorithms in the last 5 or 10 years. Automobile prices have been personalized since automobiles kind of came out, and we've paid different prices through coupons and rebates and markdowns and so on for decades, if not hundreds of years. So the idea of personalization bargaining has existed from time immemorial. That's another mechanism of personalization. I think what people perceive now is an unfairness, if you will, or a lack of surety or certainty about how their data might be used with pricing, right? And I think there are solutions to that, and I'm not saying consumers shouldn't be worried about that, but I think there's kind of there's nuance that needs to be kind of dug into here.
So we've been talking about direct consumer effects, but of course, one way in which consumers will be affected by a practice is if the practice had effect on competition between the companies in the market. What kind of competitive effect would you expect personalized pricing to have for competition between companies, who may implement personalized pricing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me start off by saying we have very limited academic understanding of this topic. I've been working on a recent project with a colleague of mine here at the University of Chicago, and just to give you kind of in a nutshell the basic idea of what we've begun to find. When you personalize, whether it's pricing or any other decision that the firm might make, you're exploding the market space in the sense that every individual or every set of characteristics that define an individual now becomes a market. So earlier you might say we have consumers. Now you might say, well, we have consumers who are male, who live in New York City, in this particular age bracket, who earn this much money, who are this old, and so on and so forth. So these segments are becoming, incredibly granular. What that does is essentially you've got firms now competing for these micro segments. If that happens, then competition gets intensified. So you could imagine now, instead of being one market, there's literally thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of markets, these micro segments, if you will, or even in the millions. And firms are competing at that level. And we know from economic theory what might happen if you compete head on, prices would go down for every consumer. So competition might exaggerate kind of the effect of personalization in terms of making deals available to people. So even affluent people might become a market and their prices might go down. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that there's forms of kind of market separation that might occur, which is now that I have this granular kind of basis of segmentation, I might say, I'll take these particular types of consumers and you take those particular kinds of consumers. I'm not talking about collusion kind of explicitly, but through algorithms, we might find these separating equilibria, which separate consumer segments out for each firm, and that might lead to less competition, if you will. Right. So we don't know very much about how this will play out, but I think that's a really good question, and the kind of segues into the point that we've made all along in our research, which is to say personalization needs to be studied a lot more, thought about a lot more, but not superficially, but at some more serious level of depth.
So understanding that, of course, it sounds like there are a lot of effects going in different directions, and there's more to be learned. What advice would you have for lawmakers or enforcers who are trying to grapple with this right now? What's the right approach to personalized pricing?
Yeah, the first one's pretty straightforward. Don't jump to conclusions, right? It might sound like personalization is bad, but you're better off, right, taking the time, being open-minded, examining all perspectives, digging deep, and essentially drilling down to seeing what the effect of personalization might be. The second thing you have to think about is the effect of personalization is going to be heterogeneous. It's going to affect different consumers differently. It's going to affect, the value to firms differently, in the sense that different firms will benefit differentially from this. So I think nuance is going to be key, trying to kind of step back and think about the bigger picture of how personalization might affect kind of the economic landscape that we're talking about. That's key before we get to a point of crafting and implementing laws. And again, I'll repeat myself, this isn't just about pricing, it's about personalization and data policies and privacies at a much broader scale.
And one thing that I find surprising or interesting is you mentioned that personalized pricing is likely to help poorer consumers and potentially hurt richer consumers. One would think that progressive lawmakers, progressive politicians would be on board with that. But what we're seeing is progressive enforcers and politicians tend to be the ones who are most concerned about the practice of personalized pricing. What's going on? Are they just not using the same economic lens that you are? Or do they think that there are other effects that we're not talking about here? Like, why do we have that conundrum?
It's a little bit of both. I think the intent is good in the sense that they're worried about kind of the negative effects of such personalization. If I had to guess, the term surveillance pricing, one of the reasons to coin it or to kind of push in that direction would be that they believe that there are serious threats to privacy, which should be taken seriously. And that's one viewpoint, which is like we should, make sure that consumers are not being taken advantage of with their data being used without their permission or in a way that kind of violates any kind of statute. So that's, I think, one difference of like how we look at it. I'm operating under the assumption that consumers are sharing their data willingly and voluntarily. And then even under those kind of assumptions, we're still not sure whether personalization is, from a big picture point of view, good or bad, as we have already discussed. But invariably, to the extent that pricing correlates with income, and we often tend to give discounts to people who are less affluent, you would think that it benefits the poor. So I think there's a little bit of both. I think there's an issue of what it is that we are going after, right? How important is privacy? How important is welfare? And there are trade-offs, and what forms of welfare are we talking about, right? And I think that discussion is a much it's a difficult discussion to have because people have preferences over the type of welfare they care about. And I think at some point we have to kind of decide what we think is more important.
So, Professor, to that end, we know the FTC is investigating personalized pricing or surveillance pricing. As it investigates, what are the most important things left to understand about personalized pricing and its effects to determine the optimal legal and policy approach to the practice?
Yeah, I'll just kind of follow on from what I was saying and just maybe expound on that a little bit more. I think one thing that we really need to do is figure out as a society how do we want to aggregate welfare? How do we want to think about welfare? First, we need to figure out how to trade off different forms of welfare. There's privacy-related welfare loss or welfare gains, if you will, and then there's economic welfare loss and welfare gains. And now we have to put them on the same scale. We have to figure out how to combine these or how to weight these. You take your pick of how you want to aggregate those. The second is, irrespective of whether we're talking about privacy-related welfare or we're talking about economic welfare, we know that different people value these welfare or value these kind of constructs differentially. So if you go to somebody who's living on the street in Los Angeles, like they don't really in that moment care about privacy, but they will care about price. Somebody else who's living on, in a nice condo in New York City might care more about privacy and slightly less about price. And so the way we measure welfare effects today is to kind of aggregate all of these using kind of uniform weights, if you will, and say they're all the same. We don't do that for tax purposes, by the way. We have differential weights we have personalized tax policies, right? And that's pricing also, a different form of pricing. And so I think part of what needs to be done is to think carefully about how to construct this welfare measure. And before we can implement or even design any policy, we need to have this, at least some semblance of consensus on what we think this welfare measure is.
So it's interesting because we were talking about weighing privacy versus other kinds of welfare. And this is very important, not just for personalized pricing, but for so much of modern enforcement in digital markets. I'm curious whether there are any leads on this being worked on in academia, among economists. How do we measure welfare from privacy and compare it to other more easily measurable traditional forms of welfare?
Yeah, there's there is continuing research on this. We don't have a definitive answer, right? I wish we did, but we don't. What we do have is a large bucket of evidence that says there are these trade-offs. Take GDPR in the EU, for example. There's enough evidence that says that privacy laws in GDPR tend to benefit larger firms at the cost of smaller firms. Now, that's not the same mechanism. It isn't operating through consumers. It might just be through kind of implementation costs of GDPR itself, where legal costs are too high for tiny firms to kind of absorb, if you will. But this trade-off, this broader trade-off that occurs between privacy policy, data policy, and personalization policy is something that, there's a lot of people trying to understand and trying to work on. Nobody, like I said, nobody has kind of the complete answer yet, but hopefully people are kind of working in that direction.
Well, if any listeners are looking for an interesting academic field to go into, sounds like there's a lot of interesting things to be discovered in this area.
Absolutely.
With that, why don't we shift to our next segment where we talk a little bit more about our guest as a person. Could you tell us something interesting about yourself that people who only know you professionally may not know about you?
Yeah, that's always a difficult question to answer. Something interesting about yourself that is, assumes that you are an interesting person. But the one thing kind of I always kind of thought was odd about myself was I love cooking, but I'm an incredibly impatient cook. So every dish that I make gets done in about 5 to 7 minutes. It doesn't matter what the dish is. It could be Thai food, it could be Indian, it could be French. The goal is to kind of get that done in about 5 minutes if you can, right? So I don't know if that's interesting, but definitely odd that most people would find that odd. So something about me.
Well, if you get more patient, maybe you can try sous videing. I've been experimenting with that recently, and that actually may be okay if long as you are willing to wait, but you don't have to do anything actively. With sous vide, you seal up something in a plastic bag, put it in hot water, and then you can walk away and wait 3 hours. So you might not eat for a while, but you also don't have to cook actively for 3 hours.
Yeah, that requires the length of time between decision to implementation to be more than 5 minutes. So it fails requirements.
Well, why don't we do our next segment, which is called The Curious Hat?
And now it's time for The Curious Hat!
Okay, Professor, this is where we ask you to pick a number from the Curious Hat, and we will ask you a random question. Can you please pick a number between 1 and 20?
Yeah, we'll go with a prime number. Let's say 70.
Okay, if you were given $50,000 on the condition that you had to spend all of it in 1 hour, what would you buy?
Currently, that's an easy one. I would buy a license to one of the large language model companies like OpenAI or Anthropic and use that to basically donate that to a large number of these NGOs that I've been working with. I seriously believe that like sharing this set of tools related to AI can have massive positive externalities in the world. And so I'm working with a bunch of NGOs in India where the bottleneck is this technology and having access to it. So the more we can kind of share, the better kind of the lot becomes, if you will. So that's what I would say.
That's fantastic. AI is an area of immense interest to our listeners. So that will be something that we will continue talking about for the next several years as AI continues to develop and change the world we live in.
Yeah, who knows? One of the listeners might just give us $50,000 to share right now.
Well, maybe we'll need to have you back in a couple of years to talk about AI. Certainly a lot to talk about there as well. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for joining us in this episode. It's been a very interesting discussion. And thank you to our listeners. please make sure to tune in next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.